Hello, class. Welcome to the third and final lecture on the urinary system. First one in person, lots of anatomy, and then the last one, kind of the meat and potatoes, looking at the physiology of how urine is made, with the tubes, filtration, glomerular filtration rates, so how fast they work. So this last one will be shorter and talk about everything after urine formation, really, and about urine. A lot of pee talk here. And our lab will be nice that we will, besides looking at the anatomy, we're going to actually be able to analyze urine, be able to see what's going on, the constituents of it, and what it means, how it's related to your health. All right. Well, first of all, the tubes, let's see if I can, I'm not going to review it all, but just some things to remember that this exam here I'm going to have you take is not write an essay, answer to how, filtration, tubular reabsorption happens. It's going to be multiple choice questions to see if you understand, right? And a lot of time talking about that loop, the nephron loop. The lecture, and if you remember, the fluid is moving down the descending limb, then up the ascending limb. And then you had the vasa recta, the blood vessels. I go in the same direction too. But the blood's going in the opposite direction. There's this countercurrent exchange mechanism. And if you some things to keep in mind is that in this descending limb, it's permeable to water. So you're going to see, water is going to leave. The other side is impermeable to water. And on the ascending loop, you pump out salts. You're pumping out, sodium and other salts like crazy. And I guess bottom line when you look at this is that what this sets up, this countercurrent multiplier, gets saltier and saltier, and the exchange that takes place in the blood, how it's going to temporarily take some of the saltiness of the water, but it comes in and comes out the same, but it's going to temporarily kind of hold those things. Bottom line is it's going to get saltier and saltier and saltier as you get deeper into the medulla. Yeah, so that it's going to set up this osmotic gradient where the deep in the medulla, it's really salty. It's like 1,200 milliosmoles, and normal is 300 coming in. And this, believe it or not, the only reason we have this complicated tubular system like this is to make that gradient where it gets saltier, 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 super salty, right? And why do we do that? The only reason is that we have collecting ducts that we're going to go down through this whole thing. And that filtrate that we got, which actually turns out to be only 100 milliosmoles by the end of it. So it's pretty watery. The only reason we set up this gradient of saltiness is so that we have the ability to either pee out very watery dilute urine or very concentrated urine with very little water, depending on our needs, how dehydrated or hydrated we are. So that's what we do. We set up this gradient. Why? Because you have coming out of here very dilute urine, filtrate, very few things in it. And so if you keep your collecting duct closed, you can pee out that extremely dilute urine and get rid of that excess water. Now, if you're dehydrated, you make ADH, an antidiuretic hormone opens up aquaporins, or these pores in the collecting duct. And so it's so salty out there that as any water coming on that tube, that water is going to be just drawn out by osmosis, right? Water is going to go towards the salt. And then you end up with a very concentrated, small amount of water that you lose. So a lot of details, when you get to the physiology of it, but that's why we set up this salty gradient, so that we can have this wonderful ability to have dark urine or light urine, depending on how much you've drunk that day, right? All right, a little bit of review there, big points. I can honestly say this was the first year, 2020, that I purchased urine. It was deer urine, but still, for hunting season, I thought, you know, give it a try, and it didn't work. But yeah, so you can get urine. Of course, in other animals, dogs and deer, there could be a lot of sexual signals in that. You know, the deer will pee, and then it'll go past, it pick up reproductive and glandular secretions, and then the deer will be sniffing for that to find the doe. All right, so first of all, we talk about urea and uric acid. These are the couple waste products we get rid of. It's a way to get rid of nitrogen. And chemically, you can see that urea is just going to be a couple ammonias with a carbonyl group, carbon and oxygen there. Yeah, doesn't seem that hard to make, you know. In organic chemistry, it's a pretty small molecule there. But yeah, and the deal with urea is kind of so interesting. That was first made, you know, synthesized in 1822. And around before that time, it was thought that the chemicals in the human body are unique, somehow magical, that they, you know, you can't make these in the lab. It's what makes life so unique, is that, you know, you have these chemicals that can only be made by life. That's crap, right? You can make any of the chemicals in your body in the lab, right? We figured it out, that we made urea, this kind of simple molecule early on. And vitalism was that idea that, you know, that life was so special that it can't be recreated in the lab. We never created life in the lab, but all the chemicals that make us up, all the chemical reactions, there's nothing mysterious that we can't explain, that we can't synthesize if we put our mind out to it. Now, urea, again, is how it's going to be a breakdown of proteins, which are the amino acids, and the amino is the nitrogen part. So when you're breaking down amino acids, you form urea. And you can actually, the amount of protein in your diet is correlated to the amount of urea, you know. So the more protein you eat in your diet, the harder the kidneys have to work. They have to get rid of more urea. So you got to get rid of that nitrogen. It's toxic if it builds up. And urea is super soluble in water, and it gets filtrated easily. It has no problem getting through that membrane, and so we get rid of this urea. I mentioned, I don't know which lecture or something, but I mentioned that that fresh urine, well, it smells like pee, all right, but old urine that's been sitting in a urinal for too long really kind of stinks. And what it is that urea breaks up into to ammonia, and then it's volatile and you smell it more. So when urine sits around, the urea water breaks it up and turns into ammonia that you can smell. And one thing with those tubes, I talked about how it got saltier and saltier as you got deeper in the medulla. And sure, it's going to be sodium and chloride and some other things, but urea too. I mean, just your book talks about it just to like give you a complete picture. Urea is also used. It's very concentrated deep in the medulla too. And so you always pee out urea. That's how we get rid of, you know, this waste. But a lot of it's recycled, you know, in that tube system, so that it keeps it nice and salty. When I say salty, I mean a lot of solutes. So it includes urea as well as your typical salts. So you use some urea to set up that osmotic gradient too. It's not just salt. So that's urea. That's what we make. Again, soluble in water, so it goes out in our pee and we get rid of it. Then uric acid, breakdown of nucleic acids. So again, you eat a steak, you get a lot of amino acids because of all the proteins from the muscle fibers, you know, actin and myosin. But then, you know, every nucleus has nucleic acids in it. We break those down and you get uric acid. And again, I'm just being kind of cheeky, obviously a bicyclic, heterocyclic purine derivative, because I'm not a chemist, but maybe some of you guys into chemistry, you're like, oh yeah, it's really cool. Most of you not probably, but okay. But uric acid is not as soluble in water, but it's a waste product that we make as well. And if you remember, that's the main waste of reptiles and birds. The bird poop, the white chalky stuff is uric acid. And it filters through the renal tubules, and we get rid of it just like urea. I'll mention a disease I want you to know about called gout. It's actually quite common. It's about 3 million cases a year in the US. Happens usually as you get older, over 40, men more than women, some genetic component. But what it is, it's a type of arthritis, I guess you could say. It's when uric acid crystals build up in your joints. And in over half the cases, you notice it in this metatarsal phalangeal number 1 joint, and the big toe, your big toe, the proximal joint just aches, very, very painful. And you got uric acid crystals when you look at that. And yeah, if you have this, I mean, they tell you to watch your diets, don't drink as much beer, exercise. These things all help, especially altering your diet so you have less things that are going to cause uric acid to build up. Includes lobster and shellfish, things like that. So, yeah, and it's not always correlated like your uric acid blood levels to having gout. So it's not like you have too much uric acid, but somehow it precipitates in some people in these joints, and it can go a lot of joints. But again, the big toe is the classic one. It was known even back in the Egyptian days, and even in Great Britain, it was known as, or in Europe, the Royals disease, or yeah, could be related to having a good diet of, things like that. It causes uric acid. Oh, interesting. Look at this. There's a correlation between uric acid levels and publication rates of university professors. Think about that. Why more active professors have more uric acid? Well, they think it's possible that the structure is similar to caffeine, and so that having high levels of this can work like caffeine, and which I told you how it works, about inhibiting phosphodiesterase. Ooh, some of you I know are going to get that, but indeed, maybe it has this caffeine-like idea, and it causes higher productivity. All right, so what is urine pee? It's mostly water, and 95%, right? That. But then, of course, you're going to be getting rid of that urea, uric acid, nitrogenous substances be gotten rid of in your urine. That's you're trying to get rid of it. We need water to wash it away. Usually, there's going to be some amino acids and proteins, although not too many, hopefully. And the electrolytes that you get rid of in your urine are going to be what your body needs to get rid of, really. If you're too acidic, there'll be a lot of hydrogen ions. If you're hypercalcemic, you don't have too much calcium, you get rid of it in your urine. So yeah, it's the way that we can maintain homeostasis. Our kidneys can pee out anything that we have too much of. And of course, drug metabolites, if you're illegal drugs or legal drugs, they'll do a urine test. Pregnancy, you give off a hormone, HCG, from fetal, very early on in development of the placenta. And so you can pee on a stick and real quickly if you have that hormone. Yeah. And of course, how much urine you make, you can make very little, like half a liter to 3-5 liters a day. Depends on how much you drink, right? And so the volume is gonna vary with how much water you need to get rid of. Yeah, so your urine is gonna has to have water to get rid of stuff, but it's gonna have the nitrogenous wastes and anything else your body wants to tinker with to give you the right mixture of electrolytes and everything like that. And any drugs that your body wants to get rid of, you break it down and you excrete it in the urine too. All right, well, in lab, we'll be able to look at your urine and see how concentrated it is. Mainly it's how hydrated you are. If you're dehydrated, you're not drinking enough water, your pee is going to have a lot of stuff in it, a lot of dissolved substances. Generally, it looks darker. And so it's a chart I got on the internet here, but you can see if you have light urine, you're probably properly hydrated. Once your urine gets darker, that means your body's conserving water, right? And the urine's more concentrated. A risk for kidney stones, but mainly, you want to be hydrated for many reasons. Your urine, you all know, maybe you don't. Some of you have never had asparagus, but if you've had asparagus and you have peed afterwards, you know that it has a unique smell. It's a chemical that I looked it up once. It's just a chemical that will show up in your urine, really quickly after eating asparagus. Beets can make your urine quite red. There's various drugs, including some antibiotics that make your urine orange colored. And there's a rare genetic disease called blue diaper disease, where you don't break down tryptophan, and it shocks some parents when they change the diapers bright blue, right? And again, it's quite rare, but they'll give the kid, make sure it's got a proper diet, like low in tryptophan, so that because there's an issue breaking it down. And if your urine has blood in it, if it's red, then you want to look, there could be some, could be anything from bladder cancer to kidney stones to all kinds of things. In the lab, we test urine. It could be menstrual blood. If you're a female, you see blood in there just because of the way you collect it there. It's not actually, in the bladder. But yes, it's been a long time that we have looked at urine as a sign of health. Even today, get a urine test, right? Blood or urine, we can look at your status, looking at that. And look at this beautiful chart. Look at this is the time of the 1500s. And they even knew, Hippocrates, that if there was too much frothiness to the urine, it's a signal of disease. And we know now it means you have protein in your urine, and you should have just traces of it, if any at all, because your body wants to keep the proteins, because that filtration membrane is small enough that protein shouldn't be able to get through unless there's some kind of damage to that membrane. Then proteins can leak out. Oh, yes, and even like I say, the smell and the taste. Let me think. Am I going to do it this year? No, I got too many labs. I got 6 labs and half the people in them. But in other labs, I would depend on. Some years I bring in apple juice and I put it in a cup in the fridge in lab, and then during the urine lab I put on gloves. I go get the cup, had some saran wrap over it for show, and I'd show you how to pipette some urine into a test tube, which you'll do. And then I was talking about it, and I would say, you remember from lecture that smell, and I would smell it. Everyone these weird faces, like, God, he smell his own pee, right? And then I say, even taste, you can it used to be used, and it's it's sterile, it's not going to hurt you. Now I would pause. It was the best. Then I would just drink the whole test tube. Great reactions. I got some great reactions. The later labs people would talk about it, but yeah, it was just apple juice. But anyway, it can be it's a little shocking to some, but taste. If you have sweet urine, it's a good indicator of some uncontrolled diabetes. Talked about that. How glucose, there's a threshold. If you have too much glucose in the blood, you can't take it all back, and so some ends up in the pee. All right, here's a term. It's really a pharmacological term. Renal clearance is the volume of plasma that can be cleared of a substance per minute or per hour, per time. So there's excretion rate, and then there's renal clearance is more volume based. And it's just a way that we use to look at mainly how long a drug lasts in your system. Each substance behaves differently in the kidneys. Some things are reabsorbed more, some things are actively secreted more, some things go through the filter, if they're more or less, depending on their size and charge. And so renal clearance is a way to look at your kidney functioning. You can calculate, you guys all should know, GFR is glomerular filtration rate. That's how well your kidneys are filtering, how much they're filtering per time. And so to measure renal clearance, inulin is a substance, and it's not insulin. Inulin is this chemical they get from a plant root, and we just know that it acts like neutrally. It gets filtered. Your body doesn't reabsorb any or get rid of any. So we can give that chemical, and then we can test a little bit later to see how much is in your blood and your pee. We can figure out the clearance of it. But you can use creatinine too, and that's a naturally occurring substance. And so you can measure renal clearance that way. So it's a way to see how well your kidneys are functioning. So the renal clearance of glucose. So what volume of plasma is glucose removed per minute? 0. You don't clear glucose. You reclaim all of it normally. All right. Beautiful. There's anatomy of a kidney. You guys will see this. The people in the lab will take a look at this big old pig kidney. But again, remember, look at the pyramids. It's a beautiful picture. You can see the cortex, the medulla in the middle. And so, the nephron, here's the glomeruli are only up here. And then some of the loops go deep in there like that. This one just goes a little bit. This one goes a little bit. But the one, these juxtamedullary ones, right at the edge can go in all the way down deep. And they're making up this gradient of saltiness, right? All right. At the renal papilla, the tip of the pyramid, is where the filtrate drips out, and then we call it urine. And the urine is going to be collected by minor calyces. They make a major calyx, renal pelvis, and out the ureter down to the bladder. My point here is that once it drips out of those papilla, urine is not modified further. We'll see in your gallbladder, you make bile, and then the gallbladder concentrates it over time. In this case, you make the pee, the bladder is just storing it. It's not doing anything to it. It's not gonna, nothing else can be added. It's too late. So once it gets out of the kidney, out of the pyramids, then that's going to be your urine. All right, let's make our way down. So if you remember, this was A&P1, week 1, lab 1 or 2, 1. We looked at epithelial tissues and you learned, oh, simple squamous, stratified squamous, cuboidal, columnar cells. Well, transitional epithelium was thrown in there. And I said, oh, you only find that in the urinary system. And so this is what lines the bladder. And it'll line anything from the calyces, the pelvis, the ureter, the bladder, a little bit of the urethra in the beginning. The outer urethra will be stratified squamous like skin, but this transitional gets its name like transitional lenses, the kind of sunglasses you wear that turn dark and darker light. It's because it means change. And it has the ability, when the bladder is empty, to be like a thick layer. And then as the bladder fills, those cells slide by each other, it gets much thinner. So it transitions from being thick to thin. The cells can slide by each other. They're pretty cool. Yeah, this has a look to it. I'll show you some more pictures. Kind of like this, has a little rounded look to it. Another thing about these transitional epithelium is that it's it's a good barrier. So like in your bladder, you don't want the pee to leak out into the tissue. So it's impermeable to water and salts. It's a nice barrier, keeps the urine in the tubes and bladder. Ah, isn't that beautiful? Look at that. Ah, there it is. Transitional epithelium. All right, we're getting down near the end here. So the urine is made in the kidneys, and it's going to go into the minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, down the ureters, into the urinary bladder. The urethra takes it to the outside. So that path, of course, sounds like a multiple choice question. Realize where the urine goes. Now your ureters that come from the kidney to the bladder, again, it's not gravity that just drips down like a IV drip. It's going to be, the urine is actually squeezed down. So it has these rhythmic movements down the ureter that squeezes the pee in front of it. And if you're making a lot of urine, it happens often. If not, it makes like every minute it kind of goes down. So these peristalsis is the movement that moves things down your gut. It also is going to move the urine down this tube. Look at it, see it has kind of the middle kind of looks like this kind of like star shape. But then when it expands, it can get really big, if you're passing a stone or a lot of urine. So that's the inside of it, lined with transitional epithelium. Yeah, so you have one on each side. Here's the kidney, and then here's the ureter. The ureters are stuck to the back wall, so they're back like retroperitoneal, like the kidneys, and then they're going to enter the bladder. You're going to see at an angle. We'll see that. And then looking at the histology of it, if you're going to look at it, you would see you're going to have that mucosa in the middle. Mucosa is going to be transitional epithelium. Then you're going to have layers of smooth muscle. Yep. And then you're going to have an outer fibrous coat, connective tissue, fat, stuff like that. So there's a good look at it. Good look at your ureter. You see the fat out here? Recognize adipose tissue on the outside, artery, vein. But yeah, you're looking at transitional epithelium, right? And then you're going to see, look at that smooth muscle, beautiful. And then you'll have kind of this, just some connective tissue on the outside. So big smooth muscle, and it's going to push the pee down. In the case of a kidney stone, it can spasm and like really try to move that stone that's stuck in there, right? Now, the interesting thing is that the ureters don't simply go into the bladder like flush. They go in a stream angle. They go at an angle. So what does this do for you? It works as a valve, all right? Because it goes in at this angle, as the bladder fills, that muscle tends to squeeze off the opening of the ureters because it goes right through the muscle. As the pressure builds, it kind of squeezes it because that urine, if the pressure builds in your bladder, it might go back up to the kidneys. That's not good. And so as it goes out, it pushes on the openings of those ureters and makes it harder for that urine to reflux up to the kidneys. So important part of the anatomy is that you have the ureters coming in at an angle through the muscle so that it's going to be self-closing as the muscle expands. Oh, and this also shows what can happen if you have a reflux into the kidney, which can happen. Men will talk about prostate gland will enlarge and you have trouble pushing that urine out. The pressure will build up and it'll go up and it'll ruin the kidneys. It'll just, the pressure will be so big that it'll balloon out and push on the normal kidney tissue. All right, so your bladder. It's a hollow, distensible, muscular organ located in the pelvic cavity. There you go. Very scientific there. You guys know what it is. It's a sac. It's muscular, and it can expand. Yeah, it gets really big when you got to go and you haven't peed for a while, right? It can really fill up. Yeah, here, I'll show you the male and female differences. I'll show you that in a diagram. Yep. And you can see there's this area called the trigone. It's a triangle, really. And it's made up 2 openings here from the ureter. This is the urethra that's going out. And it's just kind of a more solid piece of the bladder. The rest of it balloons out. That piece just kind of sits there, kind of so the tubes are some stability there. And this has the mucosa coat and then muscular and an outer connective tissue. And then it has a submucosa too. Under the mucosa, there's a submucosa. It's got some space and blood vessels, things like that. All right, so the muscle that's around your bladder is smooth muscle. And we call that muscle the detrusor muscle. So if you want to pee really hard, you got to work out your detrusor muscle. Squeeze the bladder, increases the pressure, and then you're going to have sphincters in the urethra. If you open those up, the pee will come out. All right, so men and women differ. All right, let's do that soon. But in terms of the bladder, let's take a look. In males, the bladder sits here, and behind it is the rectum, the large intestine. In females, here's the bladder, here's the rectum, but in between you have the vagina and the uterus. So there's a little difference there. You got some extra stuff going on there. And that kind of brings up that the urethra is the opening from the bladder to the outside, the urethra. And women, it's much shorter right there, very simple. And so it's going to be the reason women get more bladder infections. It's because that bacteria in the outside world, much closer to get into the bladder. In men, the urethra goes through the whole penis, all the way around. We even have like 3 different parts to it. And that urethra has mucus glands, and so it's going to help keep bacteria from getting into your body that way. And so the shorter it is, the more likely that bacteria can reach, the bladder. So males have an advantage there. And every time we pee, it actually is helpful. It washes stuff out, right? Because bacteria on the outside of your skin doesn't want to. Yeah, it doesn't want to. If getting inside of you would have a place for it to grow, etc. So we try to keep that from happening. Also to bring up here, pregnant women sometimes really have to pee. I wouldn't know, of course, but that's what I hear. And if you think about it, this uterus gets huge, right? And so you can see that the bladder sits right behind your pelvis, your pubic symphysis, and here's the bladder. So if your uterus is big, it's going to push on that bladder to make it uncomfortable, if your bladder's full. That makes sense. Yeah. And normally if you have to pee really bad, in an adult, the bladder will kind of balloon up, but in kids, it even goes like up even higher. Let's get into that, I guess. Very cool. All right. And then in men, I just got to say, the urethra forms has two different functions. It carries the urine, and that's what a woman's urethra does only, but a man also carries the reproductive products, the fluid from reproduction. And so you can see here's the testes. You're going to have two of these vas deferens that come into it. And so that in here, you're going to see in the prostate gland, here's the urethra for pee, and you're going to see the semen is going to come and it's going to meet right here as like a little flap-like valve. So the urine's coming this way from the bladder, and then the sperm and all the fluids are going to come also in that same tube. So another big difference. Okay. Yeah, so here we're looking at, is it going to be a male bladder? Because I see the two ductus deferens and some glands, and I see a prostate gland. So we'll get to this, talk about the prostate gland with reproduction. But it's a good view looking inside the bladder. You can see here's this trigone. See that? And you've got the ureters and the urethral opening there. Yeah, and so there's two sphincters. Same with the anal sphincter. With this sphincter, you have an internal urethral sphincter right here, and then you'll have an external urethral sphincter further down here. Turns out you control the external one. Well, at a certain point, when you become potty trained, you have more control of these sphincters here. But then the internal one is a smooth muscle. It's more autonomically controlled. And so we'll see, when you have to pee, once you have ability to be continent, incontinence is you don't have control over urinating. But if you can control it, that if you have to pee but you're not at a restroom, you can make that external sphincter contract, right? And only when you actually want to urinate can you relax it and then squeeze the detrusor muscle and the urine will come through. And the internal one is automatically controlled. Yeah, here's a real life view. It's always not as pretty as the picture, but there's that trigone. When you look inside a bladder, all of it's kind of gross looking. And then the trigone is kind of smooth and solid. And you have, again, three openings here, the uretic orifices from the ureters, then the urethral orifice, call it the internal urethral orifice, is the opening from the bladder on its way to the urethra. Good view, I mean, just the histology, you can see all of this is going to be that detrusor muscle, all this smooth muscle. And you've got the mucus coat is transitional epithelium. The space that you see here will be the submucosa. Yeah, and then I see fat, I see adipose tissue and blood vessels on the outside. All right, so the urethra, some tube. By the time you get to the end, we'll call that the external urethral orifice. I was going to say the pee hole on the outside, but we're not going to call it the pee hole. We'll go with external urethral orifice. And that'll be stratified squamous. And as it goes up, it'll turn into transitional before it gets into the bladder. And you always have sphincters here, urethral sphincters. Remember, internal urethral sphincter is autonomic. External urethral sphincter, you control. All right, so the urethra is the tube that carries, here's the bladder, here's the urethra. There's the pee. Yeah, and again, you can see, because females, it's so much shorter, you get more likely to have an infection there. And in men, I mean, it has, again, dual function, reproduction as well. And then the urethra in the male, if this was a male, you have the prostate gland here stuck there. So you have, we call this the prostatic urethra. And there's a little bit called the membranous urethra when it's kind of naked. And then, draw penis, but this is called the penile or spongy urethra here. So there's actually three parts to it. And females just call it the urethra. Yeah, you can take a look here. So you can see the short urethra in the female, male longer. We even talk about prostatic, membranous, penile urethra. Yep. External urethral orifice is where the pee comes out on the outside. Internal urethral orifice on the inside when the pee is leaving the bladder. Nice picture of a urethra. It shows, you see all the glands here? So in your urethra, you make mucus, and that'll help. It's part of your innate immune system, right? Mucus is going to trap pathogens from getting into your body through your urethra. Again, that urine will wash it away too. All right, you want to get technical about having to pee here, and the feeling of your bladder being full and having to go, right? So if you take a look, I just thought I'd throw this in here to show you. When the bladder is filling, you can see it can fill first 100, 200, 300. That is going to be volume, okay? How much milliliters of fluid are going to be forming. But then when the bladder starts getting full, then the pressure just rises quickly, right? Because if you fill between 100 and 200, there's no increase in pressure. It's like a distended balloon that's opening. But once you get to when it's full, then any more milliliter is going to cause a lot of pressure. So you can see the pressure really rise. And that's when you get this urge to urinate, is when the bladder can fill all day long, but when it gets to that point where it's full, then that pressure, and you have sensors, stretch receptors, go back to your spinal cord. They're going to make you aware that you need to find a bathroom or a tree or whatever. Yep. So I just want to get to that point, that pressure is going to rise rapidly once the bladder has been stretched to a certain point. Yeah, I don't put it anywhere here, but here's but you all know what a catheter is, right? I think you all do, right? But if you're in a hospital or something like that, they can put a tube in there, usually a balloon to keep it in there, and connect it to a bag. So a catheter can be put in men and women, and it's a tube that goes from your bladder directly to a bag on the outside. They can easily measure urine production, and yeah. All right, another fancy term for urination is micturition. So mastication is chewing, completely different. Micturition is urination. You can see, we'll talk about that. It's a quick video here too. Yeah, you guys can read, right? I know you can. I like it. So as it's stretched, the receptors are going to signal lower spinal cord right there. Parasympathetic nerves are going to go, and you'll contract that detrusor, and you relax that internal sphincter, but you control that external sphincter. And if your mind says, I don't want to pee now, you can hold that shut, and then you can tell your detrusor muscle to relax. It'll listen to you for a while. But then eventually, when you make the conscious decision, that skeletal muscle is that external sphincter, you decide to relax that, and then the detrusor muscle will, the nerves will cause it to contract, and the pressure is going to cause the fluid goes from higher to lower pressure. The fluid's going to be peed out until that's going to tire the muscle, and then you voided your bladder, and then you can contract those sphincters, and the bladder can fill up again to begin again. Let's take a listen here. I think you should be able to hear this.
The micturition reflex involves impulses traveling from the urinary bladder to the sacral region of the spinal cord, and from the sacral region of the spinal cord back to the bladder. It is coordinated by neurons in the spinal cord and can be influenced by signals from the brain. When the urinary bladder becomes stretched, there is an increase in the frequency of action potentials carried from the bladder wall to the sacral region of the spinal cord. In response, parasympathetic neurons from the spinal cord to the bladder are activated, and this causes the smooth muscle on the bladder wall to contract. The sensory signals to the sacral region of the spinal cord also stimulate ascending pathways to the pons and cerebrum, which results in a conscious desire to urinate. If urination is not convenient at the time, the brain sends impulses down the spinal cord to inhibit the micturition reflex. Impulses carried via somatic motor neurons keep the external urinary sphincter contracted, which also prevents urination. When urination is desired, signals from the brain stimulate the micturition reflex. The brain also decreases action potentials in the somatic motor neurons to relax the external urinary sphincter.
Very nice. So you guys got that? Notice your cerebrum is made aware of these things. And if you decide to inhibit that micturition reflex is when you're not at a bathroom yet, and you can inhibit that. And then when you decide to go ahead and urinate, then that sphincter is relaxed. It's skeletal muscle, so it's somatic neurons are going to relax it. And then you allow the detrusor muscle to contract. Urination takes place. All right. All right, finally, to wrap up, I mean, some of the things, abnormalities with the urinary system, talked quite a bit about polycystic kidney disease. So I won't talk anymore about that. Make sure you know that. Here's a picture of a horseshoe kidney. Pretty cool. They're still connected like that. And then the others, I won't, I'm not going to specifically ask you about the others, but all kinds of things can go wrong. You can be born with one kidney or have all kinds of issues. All right, so urinary system, what happens as you get older? Well, as with everything, it's going to, the function is going to go downhill. More and more of it, just with 80, 90, 100 years of use, is going to turn into scar tissue. It's not going to work as well. The tubes are going to thicken. So that definitely happens. But let me just tell you this. The redundancy, because you have two kidneys and you only need one, and is that you don't normally see any issue, many issues with kidneys with age. We talk about the heart and the lungs and all these things. Everything goes downhill, but you're able to pee. You get very, very old. Again, you can also incontinence is happens more often, and it's like with life. When you're at the beginning of life and end of life, you lose the ability to control your bladder, right? And there's some of that, of course. But the kidneys, as you look at it, especially looking at pharmacologically, drug dosages are different depending on your age. As you get older, your kidneys don't have the ability to clear substances. Like if you're younger, you can see it. It shrinks by age 80. Kidneys have lost a third of their mass, yeah. The bladder holds less urine, so you have to go to the bathroom more often, definitely. So yeah, the kidneys, again, they're just not as efficient at removing waste, and et cetera. But normally you're going to be, it's not, you're still going to be able to survive, right? As long as your kidneys are okay. All right, we have a chapter here, a shorter chapter for sure, looking at water and electrolyte balances. And so I'll put a couple lectures on that. So hopefully you guys got this urinary chapter down, and that plus the big respiratory, the big ones. And then I'll throw on the water electrolytes before the next test. All right. Hope you guys have a great night.